Somewhere in the basement of the Fisk University Library, there is a box. It is not a dramatic box. It is acid-free, gray, the kind of archival container that librarians order by the pallet. It holds, among other things, a handwritten letter dated 1905, written by a man who could produce, in a single afternoon, more precise and devastating prose than most writers manage in a lifetime. The letter is not to a president or a king. It is to his daughter, Yolande, who was 6 years old at the time. He is telling her about a bird he saw outside his window at Atlanta University that morning. A red bird, he writes. It sat on the branch and looked at me as though it recognized something. That sentence has no footnote in the scholarly literature. Nobody writes dissertations about it. But it is the sentence that unlocks everything. Because here is what nobody tells you about W.E.B. Du Bois. The thing that gets lost between the statue and the syllabus, between the monument and the man. He was, above everything else, a person who paid ferocious attention. Not the cold, clinical attention of a man assembling arguments. The hot, almost painful attention of someone who could not stop noticing the world. The texture of it. The weight of it. The way light moved through it. He noticed everything except, perhaps, one thing. He never knew what the bird recognized. He noticed the bird. He wrote it down. He moved on to the next sentence, the next argument, the next petition, the next chapter of the next book, because that was the engine of the man. Perpetual forward motion, perpetual production, as though stopping meant something he was not prepared to name. By the time he was 40, he had already written more than most scholars produce in a full career. By 60, the output was simply incomprehensible. Books, essays, editorials, speeches, letters, tens of thousands of letters. A river of language that never stopped moving. And underneath all of it, running like a current beneath the current, was a question he circled his entire life without ever landing directly on it. Not the political question, not the sociological question. Something older than both of those. Something that had nothing to do with Harvard or Berlin or the NAACP or any of the institutions that shaped the public architecture of his mind. The question was simpler than all of that. It was almost embarrassingly simple for a man of his complexity. Where do I actually come from? Not in the civic sense. Not in the sense of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he was born in a small house on Church Street in February of 1868. The winter still locked hard around the Berkshire Hills. Not in the biographical sense that his readers knew. The free black family, the Dutch surname, the absent Haitian father who left a forwarding address that turned out to be nowhere. He knew all of that. He had assembled it himself with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. The question that remained, the one that sat at the back of every room he ever walked into, quiet and patient, as a man who has learned that patience is the only weapon available to him, was what existed before the assembling was possible, before the records, before the names that other people had given his family, before the paper trail dissolved into the particular silence that the archive reserves, specifically and cruelly, for Black Americans who try to walk backward through their own history, far enough to find solid ground. He knew where that silence began. Every Black person in America knew exactly where that silence began. It began at the water. The water. He returned to it again and again in his writing, in ways that his literary critics catalogued and debated, without ever quite agreeing on what it meant. The river in souls of Black folk. The Ocean in Dark Water, that 1920 collection, whose very title placed the Atlantic at the center of the Black experience, made the water itself a character, gave it an adjective that was neither clean nor contaminated, but something more ambiguous and more honest than either. Dark water. Water that holds things. Water that does not give them back. There is a passage in Dark Water that most readers move through too quickly because it does not announce itself as important. It arrives between two more obviously political chapters and reads almost like a dream sequence, like something that slipped through the editorial net. Du Bois describes standing at the edge of the ocean. He does not say which ocean, does not say which shore, and feeling what he calls a pull that had no name in the language he had been given. He was a man with more languages than most people have opinions. He read German philosophy in the original. He had studied in Berlin, walked the same streets as Hegel's ghost, absorbed the entire Western intellectual tradition with the focused appetite of someone who understood that mastering the master's tools was the first step in something larger. And still, standing at the water, the feeling he was trying to describe had no word in any of those languages. The Congolese had a word for it. They had always had a word for it. Kalunga, the boundary. The membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the known and the unknowable, between the self you can see and the self that exists on the other side of the water. But Du Bois did not know that word. Nobody had taught it to him. It had been traveling toward him for 300 years, carried in the cellular memory of his maternal line, passed from woman to woman through the Burghardt family of Western Massachusetts, waiting for the moment when the science would finally exist to make the transmission legible. That moment had not yet arrived in Du Bois's lifetime. He died in 1963 without it. He died having felt the pull and never knowing its precise origin, like a man who spends his whole life hearing a song from the next room and never manages to open the door. But the door was always there. The Burghardt women knew things they did not say out loud. This is not mysticism. This is simply how knowledge survives in families that have learned, across generations, that certain truths are safer carried in the body than spoken in a room where the wrong person might be listening. Mary Sylvina Burghardt, Du Bois' mother, was a quiet woman by all accounts, not timid. There is a difference, and it matters. Timidity is the absence of something. Mary Sylvina's quietness was the presence of something contained, something held deliberately, the way you hold a full cup when the floor beneath you is uncertain. She raised her son alone in Great Barrington after Alfred Du Bois disappeared, and she did it with a steadiness that her son would later describe with a reverence he rarely extended to anyone. He was not a sentimental man. He did not traffic in easy tenderness. But when he wrote about his mother, something in the prose changed temperature. It became careful in a different way. The way you are careful with something irreplaceable. She died when Du Bois was 16. A stroke, sudden, the kind of death that arrives without the courtesy of preparation. He was old enough to understand exactly what he had lost, and not old enough to have asked her everything he should have asked. This is one of the great recurring tragedies of genealogy. Not the records that burned, not the names that were never written down, but the conversations that almost happened. The questions that were forming in a young mind while the person who held the answers was still alive and sitting in the next room, and then one morning she was not. What did Mary Sylvina know about where the Burghardts had come from? What had her mother told her, and what had her mother's mother told her before that, in the particular register of knowledge that black families in New England passed down not in documents, but in the texture of how they moved through the world, in the specific gravity of certain silences, in the way certain women in the family would sometimes stop at the edge of a body of water and stand there longer than the moment required? We cannot know. The conversation did not happen, or if it happened, it was not written down, and if it was written down, the paper did not survive, and if the paper survived, it has not yet been found. What survived instead was the DNA. Indifferent to tragedy, indifferent to the gap between the question and the answer, indifferent to the 16-year-old boy standing at his mother's grave in the Berkshire winter, not yet knowing what he had lost beyond the woman herself. Great Barrington in the 1870s was a small world with precise boundaries, and Du Bois understood those boundaries the way a person understands the walls of a room they have lived in long enough to stop seeing them. The town was not aggressively hostile to its black residents in the manner of the Deep South. There were no signs, no explicit codes, no organized violence that announced itself as such. The cruelty of Great Barrington was more ambient than that. It was the kind of cruelty that operates through omission, through the small daily calibrations of who is invited and who is not, who is seen as belonging to the landscape and who is seen as a feature of it, present but not central, acknowledged but not fully real. Du Bois would later describe his first conscious encounter with this particular species of exclusion with characteristic precision. A moment in school when a white girl refused to accept his visiting card during an exchange of cards among classmates. Refused it with a glance that contained, he wrote, no hatred, no particular malice, just a casual and complete denial of his existence as someone whose card was worth receiving. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old. He stood there holding the card and understood, in the specific way that children understand things that adults have not yet explained to them, that the world had a structure, and he was on the outside of it. What he did with that understanding, the direction he chose to run with it, was not toward assimilation, not toward the careful performance of acceptability that the structure seemed to demand, but toward something harder and more expensive and ultimately more honest. He ran toward knowledge. He ran toward the archive, toward the library, toward the university, toward Berlin and back, as though understanding the structure completely and precisely was itself a form of power over it. As though if you could describe the cage in sufficient detail, with sufficient accuracy, the description itself became a kind of key. He was not entirely wrong about this, but he was not entirely right either. And the part where he was not right is the part that the DNA illuminates in a way that no amount of archival precision could have done for him. Because the archive, for all its revelations, operates within the same temporal boundaries that confine Du Bois himself. It can take you back to Tom Burghardt in 18th century Massachusetts. It can take you to the colonial records of Berkshire County, to the militia rolls, to the faded tax assessments that prove the Burghardts owned land and paid for the privilege of existing in a country that was still deciding whether people who looked like them were entitled to exist at all. And then it stops. The paper ends. The names dissolve. The Burghardt line walks backward into a silence that the documents cannot penetrate, and you are left standing at the edge of the archive the way Du Bois stood at the edge of the ocean, feeling the pull of something on the other side that has no name in the available language. The 1870 census for Berkshire County, Massachusetts, is held in the National Archives, and if you request the microfilm and thread it through the reader and advance it slowly enough, you can watch the Burghardt family materialize out of the bureaucratic fog of post-Civil War America with a clarity that feels almost violent in its contrast to what comes before. There they are, named, aged, occupied, valued, real in the specific way that the state makes people real, by writing them down and keeping the paper. Othello Burghardt, farmer, his wife, his children and grandchildren arranged around him in the census taker's neat columns, like a family portrait rendered in statistics. There is something almost tender about it, despite the cold administrative language, despite the fact that the man conducting the census almost certainly did not feel tenderness while he was doing it. The tenderness belongs to the historian looking backward, understanding what it cost this family to appear on this page with names intact, understanding how many families did not. But go back 10 years. Pull the 1860 census for the same county, the same township. The Burghardts are there again, still named, still present, still occupying the same improbable position of free black landowners in antebellum New England. Go back further. The 1850 census, still there. The family persisting through the decades with a stubbornness that feels almost like a philosophical statement. Like the Burghardts understood that remaining in one place, remaining nameable, remaining on the correct side of the ledger was itself a form of resistance that required as much discipline and courage as anything more obviously dramatic. Now try to go back further than 1850. Try to follow Tom Burghardt, the progenitor, the man who appears at the origin of the American branch of this family as a free man in western Massachusetts in the late 18th century, back through the decades before the census existed, back through the colonial records that are sparse and inconsistently kept, and in several cases simply gone, burned or rotted or lost in the specific entropy that archives suffer when the people they document are not considered important enough to preserve carefully. You are following a thread through a darkening room. The thread is real. Your hand is on it. But the room is getting darker with every step backward, and the thread is getting thinner. And then at some point between the founding of the American Republic and the Middle Passage, the thread does not break so much as it simply becomes too fine to feel with human fingers. This is the wall, not a metaphor, an actual material limit of the documentary record, built from the specific indifference of a society that did not consider the origins of its black residents worth recording. The wall does not announce itself. It does not say, "Here is where the history of this family becomes the history of property, and property does not have origins worth tracking." It simply goes quiet. The names stop. The paper ends. And the silence on the other side of that wall is so complete, so deliberately constructed, that standing in front of it feels less like reaching the edge of knowledge and more like standing in front of something that was built to stop you specifically. The DNA does not care about the wall. It passed through it without asking permission, carried in the mitochondria of every Burghardt woman who ever stood at the edge of water and felt something she could not name pulling at her from the other side. The analysis is unambiguous. The haplogroup points to Central Africa, to the Congo Basin, to the people who built Mbanza Congo on a plateau above the river that swallows all rivers, who had a word for the boundary between worlds long before Du Bois invented his own. Kalunga. He felt it his whole life. He just never knew what to call it.